Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our native ancestors' stories and history alive while also sharing with you our native cultures, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And stay tuned for the end of each episode where we'll talk about some great ways to support Native causes and or Native-owned businesses. Let's get started.
I am more than a maker.
More than an athlete.
More than a pastor.
Chata ili finachili.
I am Choctaw proud.
We are the Choctaw Nation, and together we're more.
So, in season 2, episode 18, I got together with Megan Baker from Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma Historic Preservation Department. We talked through her extensive work in tracing the history of our Choctaw people, decade by decade, and in monthly articles of the Iti Fabvssa in our Choctaw paper called Biskinik. So, back by popular demand. Welcome back, Megan.
Thank you for having me.
It's only been a year since our last recording.
Only a year. It feels like so much longer.
I know. Doesn't it feel, I mean, like we were just talking about this before we started, you guys, and how a year goes by fast, but at the same time, it seems like we just recorded it the other day. I don't know. It's crazy. So thanks again for hopping on. I know you're super busy. A lot has happened in the last year, right?
Yeah, I finished the series, finished writing it. That was something I was doing every month. And so once I finished, someone else did an article and I was like, wow, a month off from writing. This is amazing.
Oh, that must have felt great. And I mean, the stuff that you wrote about, as I was telling you earlier, it was really awesome to be able to have these complex pieces of information that are scattered out amongst, textbooks, history books, but even deeper stuff, the information that Choctaw Nation provides that the general public doesn't always have access to. And then you were able to kind of put it into layman's terms so folks like myself could really understand what was going on through the decades with our people. And then also you got your PhD completed, correct?
No, not yet. I'm supposed to finish it this year.
Oh, okay. So you're really close though.
Yeah. So this year, I started working part-time, so I'm not full-time anymore. So now I'm supposed to be focusing on just writing my dissertation. And then after that, I will be done with it. And then I start to work on it as a book.
Oh, that'll be cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, please keep us updated on what's going on with that as you're almost done with your PhD. Super excited for you. That's one for the girls team as well. Well, I should say the Native girls team. In addition, you went to France recently, right?
Yeah. So we've been working on an exhibit to bring some Choctaw items and some other Southeastern items to the cultural center. So we did a delegation visit to see the items all together in person and make sure they're all safe to travel and all of that kind of stuff. We also did some workshops with the museum people. We taught them how to make Choctaw moccasins, how to play stickball. We got to play stickball in front of the park in front of the Eiffel Tower, which was really cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was really fun. And just, going out, visiting River Cane. We did that kind of last week with Evelyn Steele. And so we collected some. And then this past Friday, I went over to her house to learn how to, strip River Cane so you can have it to make baskets. And so just fun stuff like that.
The day in the life of Megan Baker. I want to be you. Please let me be you.
It's a very Choctaw life, and I'm very happy with it.
I bet. And even just that playing stickball in front of the Eiffel Tower. How cool is that? So In our previous episodes together about our Choctaw history through the decades, we started in 1830 and ended around the early 1900s. So we'll pick up where we left off at a time when President Theodore Roosevelt made it known that he preferred that Oklahoma and Indian territories enter the Union as a single state rather than two, as had been proposed. And with this, Indian Territory faced a future in which they would be enjoined with Oklahoma Territory. So these next few decades will cover our crucial decades. You've got statehood and life for the Choctaw after land allotments, a fight against termination, and so on. So let's start with what was going on in Choctaw history in the 1900s. Our people were facing issues with citizens' roles and their land allotments and potential Oklahoma statehood. So it was obviously a trying time for a lot of folks. Our Choctaw people never seemed to have even just a moment to catch a breath. There was constant fear of losing more and more of the land in Mississippi, and that concern came true. And then there were worries about being removed and placed in Indian Territory. This also came true. And then once in Indian Territory, they started to rebuild their homes, community, government. And now this new land was being threatened with a push from white settlers to claim the land that had now been designated to the American Indian. So in the western part of Indian Territory were unassigned lands that in 1889 were opened to white settlers. And this was a famous event known as,
The land run.
right? I guess we could give gold stars for anyone who answered the same, but if we knew who they were. So what was the original intention of the lands in Western Oklahoma prior to the land run?
Yeah, so basically all of the land that was kind of Oklahoma was originally designated to the five tribes through the treaties. So everything that was basically southern Oklahoma and then just a little bit into the Texas Panhandle, that was originally allocated to Choctaws when we signed our 1830 treaty. So we should have had all of that land across that. But as the articles kind of talk about, slowly each of those, they're kind of brought into smaller parcels. So they had to get rid of the part that went to Texas, and then there's a parcel that was like the western lands, and so that was kind of like the least district is what they called it. And then you had a section, half of that middle section became Chickasaw Nation when the Chickasaws came over and settled in Indian Territory. And then, of course, we have, Choctaw's small parcel. So it all gets really kind of chopped up. And so the other, like the hierarchies had a lot more of theirs, and that gets kind of whittled down as well. And so they kind of decide to kind of allocate that. It's like, oh, maybe we'll put all the Western tribes in this kind of area. And then eventually, they're like, we can move some white people over here. And so then it becomes that parcel known as Oklahoma Territory.
I find it interesting that sounds like they may have had the mindset, maybe not all of them making these decisions, but there seemed to be a mindset of, oh, this will be easy. We'll just do it this way. And it's like, oh, well, there are human beings involved in this whole situation. But so those Western tribes, the Plain tribes, what was supposed to happen to those tribes then if the area was going to be opened up to settlers?
So they get kind of moved off. I don't know this part as well, but I think they are kind of like allocated to much smaller parcels,
Okay.
further south.
Gotcha. All right. So Indian Territory was supposed to be designated to all the tribes that had moved in, many of their people suffering and dying along the way to get there. So how in the world did this land grab happen to come about? How was this even allowed when this was territory designated to the tribes?
It's the years of kind of different treaties going on, like just in the case for Choctaw Nation, like what was a very large parcel of land gets chopped up into littler and smaller pieces. And I think that happens in those other parts of what eventually kind of becomes Oklahoma territory. You have those kinds of parts. They're like, oh, the Cherokees aren't using this land, so we're just going to kind of make it the Cherokee outlet and kind of all of those different things. And that it happens in those like small kind of legal ways. You know, each of those tribes are going through their own kinds of issues. Like there are things that the US government isn't upholding in the treaties. And so they're kind of so desperate for, you know, the things that they were already promised. They're like, okay, fine, then like another cession of land. And
Wow.
so that's kind of, you know, they're really pushed in these positions that they don't want to, but you know, like some people, you know, Peter Pitchlynn was really desperate to get money that Choctaw Nation had been owed. And so he became a lot more open to like different kinds of things that he wouldn't have otherwise, because it was like, here's a couple $1,000,000 that's like not been paid out and that needs to be paid out. And so they make all these concessions, but then they don't even get what they're kind of
Right.
promised. And so that's a really big thing that's happening in that time period.
And such is the story of the Native American, my God. So, for those of us who grew up in Oklahoma, the land run of April 22nd, 1889, was really a big part of our Oklahoma history education. And those lands that were supposed to be reserved for the Plains Indians and other tribes, but were about to be opened up to non-native settlers, were considered really ideal areas. And those lands were, according to oklahomahistory.org, the Cherokee outlet on the north, bordering Kansas, the Iowa, Kickapoo, Potawatomi reservations on the east, and the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservations on the west. And these two would later be opened to settlement. To the south lay the Chickasaw Nation, as you mentioned earlier. So now comes the land run, a land grab for settlers to lay claim to these lands that had been promised to the Indians. And the article goes on to say, the great dramatic moment came when at the stroke of noon, starting signals were given at the many points of entry. In some instances, it was given by a blue-clad military officer firing his pistol, or by a trumpeter, at times by a citizen firing his rifle in the air, or, as at Fort Reno, by the boom of a cannon. All produced the same results, a tumultuous avalanche of wagons and horsemen surging forward all in one breathtaking instance. That had to have been a crazy sight to see, huh?
Yeah, and Oklahomans love to kind of recreate this moment. It's such a moment of kind of origin, but it's such a like profound moment of like dispossession, and that's always kind of you know,
Right.
that always gets whitewashed. I think a lot of the times, you know, a lot of Native groups in Oklahoma, Native have been like, we shouldn't have these land runs. These are racist. Like these celebrate really genocidal policies, and you know, they're really insistent upon it. And so I don't know. It's one of the great complications I feel like of, you
Isn't
know,
it?
living in Oklahoma and like knowing that like this is how this place came into being, but then you like still love this place, and so
Right. I
yeah, you know,
know.
it's really weird.
There's such a conflict in my brain. Like there's this book that I loved reading when I was younger called the Oklahoma Land Run, or just Land Run. But I still love the book because it really does. It's written by a woman who didn't grow up in Oklahoma, and yet she captures Oklahoma so well about the red dirt, and then, all these things happen leading up to the actual run itself. It's not really a history book. It's a romance novel. But to this, back then I was like, oh, this is so exciting. And then later in life, when I started realizing what really was going on, about how sad this actually was, and it had to have been terrifying for, the natives that were living there and that had already been removed there. And then they might lose their land again. And who knows, it's got to be so unsettling. So yeah, my brain is very much at conflict as well. But as you know, our University of Oklahoma Sooners are named after those settlers who cheated by arriving early in their desired land area, and they hid out prior to the actual legal time of entry. So they were known as the Sooners. And I remember at one point in my life thinking about how exciting and dangerous and wild the land run must have been. But the backstory, as you and I were talking about, of whose land they were running after, was the very last inch of land and hope given to others who had had everything taken from them. And it's a very sad thought. They lost people on the way to these lands that they were promised. So again, at this time in history, what is now called the state of Oklahoma was then known as Indian Territory. And all of these actions, such as the land run, were leading up to statehood. So how did that come about? How did statehood come about?
So the US have all like I guess we could start, 1890 is kind of known as the closing of the Indian Wars, right? This is when
Mm-hmm.
the US Army is like fighting Native people. You have the Battle of Wounded Knee. And so that's kind of a big defeat. And so they're like, oh, all right. So, like, we've conquered the whole continent. And so they start to like look inward and they're like, oh, what land is kind of left? What's left to conquer? And so, I think Indian Territory is this really big island in the middle of the continent in which that is like still belongs to Native people, and like they hold title, obviously, like for the five
Right.
tribes at least, they hold the title to their lands. And so I think there's this kind of real turn to like and focus on Indian Territory and kind of like, oh, how do we get this kind of area, and how do we kind of incorporate that into the United States? And so that area that was part of the land run, it eventually kind of comes together as Oklahoma Territory. And
Okay.
then meanwhile, you have the five tribes lands that's collectively kind of seen as Indian Territory, even though you have like, you know, um, in Cherokee Nation, they have other tribes kind of living in their land. And so it's kind of an amalgamation of all of them, but it's basically those lands of the five tribes.
For sure. And I remember reading in your article about how after that land run that Congress had passed the Organic Act of 1890, which organizes lands into Oklahoma Territory. So first it had to become a territory and then a state and then join the USA. I never even thought about that. It's been so long since we've created a new state. So in 1906 Congress passed the Five Tribes Act, and that was trying to change how tribal governments operated, right? So the US became responsible for land offices and the entire school systems and all that, right?
Yes. And so, but kind of even before that, right? Like you start to have that process of allotment. And so that's really what kind of leads up to that 1906. So you
Oh,
have to have that happen, of course, before you get to kind of that point, because
right.
allotment, which kind of starts back in, you could start to say it's like in 1893 when like the Congress creates the Dawes Commission essentially to send out um, these three people to kind of do a poll of the five tribes, being like, "Do you guys support allotment?" And they really, really tried to convince everyone that allotment was a good idea, but like everyone just kept being like, "No, we do not want allotment."
You're gonna love it. You're gonna love it. It's gonna be great.
Yes. And so I think it's like about the first two times they fail, like just it's a complete failure. And so they
Yeah.
just keep having to go back and they're trying to like, convince people that allotment's a good idea. And so this is kind of, when the US, there's a lot more pressure being put on those five tribes
Mm,
to allot their lands because, allotment means like everyone has private property and it's kind of individual ownership, which is very different from the way that the five tribes owned it. Like they owned it collectively. Choctaw Nation
right.
had title to the land collectively. So you can't just like sell off parcels on your own as an individual. Everyone had to really commit to it. And so it was really, really difficult for them to get allotments to kind of happen. And so, I'm kind of skipping over to another part of the articles, but
You're
everyone,
fine.
the leaders, like, so it's something that became debated in Choctaw politics. It was like a really hot topic, and you had like pro allotment people, anti allotment people, and so they're just like constantly kind of going back and forth about it. But I think what eventually kind of wins out is that people are like, we can't stop allotment from happening. Look how it's happened across the United States. You know, they're really like taking a step back and looking at the landscape. Like, how have tribes like handled allotment? How's it kind of like worked out for them? Because, you know, all the other tribes had allotment back in 1887, and so the 5 tribes are among the few who haven't had their lands allotted. So they kind of like, they're just reading the room. You know, they can see what's kind of going on.
Yes.
So the dominant kind of idea is like, you know, I don't think we can do that much about it. So we should do this on our own terms. You know, we should like just say yes to allotment, but then we get to decide exactly kind of how it's done. And so that actually ends up being what happens for at least Choctaw Nation. Like, they're able to negotiate certain kinds of terms that are a little bit more advantageous than I think maybe some of the other 5 tribes. And so that's a really kind of significant thing that's happening in that allotment period. And so that's under Green McCurtain. He's kind of, I know there are so many memes on Facebook where people are like, Green McCurtain is the biggest traitor to all Choctaw people. And I understand that sentiment, because like I think everyone wants to be gung-ho anti-US government, but I think if you were in their shoes and you saw the way that things were operating, like, you can understand a little bit better. And maybe that's just something that I would like people to know. It's like, it's not an easy decision, you know. Look at everything that's going on around you. Like, it's like they've said it's the end of the Indian Wars. Like, they're out there killing Native people. And so you know, it's a response to kind of all of that. And it's like, how do you make sure people live, you know, another generation? And so like that they're not all killed like they've happened with other Native people. And so, you know, there's so much complexity to it. And so I think I've always wanted people to be able to maybe understand that a little bit better before, you know,
before judging.
Yeah.
What would you do? You know,
yeah, like if you had all these kinds of resources, you know, like we had people in Congress, we had very educated people, and they were doing what they thought was best in those kinds of circumstances.
Absolutely. And it's something that I kind of get on a soapbox about too. I'm so glad you said that, because again, who knows what the right answer or the right thing would be to do for in any of those situations, but all they could see was that, okay, we can either be wiped out forever, or, you know, we can try to fight back. We can have a business mind and basically go, how much can we possibly get out of this and take advantage of the situation to our benefit? Because it's probably our only option in the whole scheme of things, if we want to keep everyone safe and continue to build our tribe and to build our people and to continue having more babies and that kind of thing, instead of just allowing the tribe to die out at the hands of the non-natives. So I am completely with you on this topic, for sure, on many topics, but for sure on this one too, because
yeah. And I think the other part of it is like, you know, not everyone obviously agreed, and not everyone's going to do the same thing. Of course, like there are some people who are like, I'm not even gonna bother with this, like I'm just gonna keep living over here by myself. Is what we've always done. And like I think like you need that kind of range of people, right? Like,
yeah, sure,
you have to have people who can negotiate with the US government in this kind of way, but then you also need people who are going to keep traditional life alive, and, you know, like keep that going at home. And so
takes all kinds. I love
we're
that.
not all enemies with one another, you know, like I think the real enemy is kind of these governments trying to undermine us, and so we should be working together against that, you know. Like,
girl,
I think there's a role for everyone.
That is so well said. I think it needs to go on our next Christmas card or something, you know. It takes all kinds. It's okay to have different varying opinions as long as you're respecting people and trying to see that other side of the story, because I would not want to be a chief during that time. No way.
Yeah, no, I don't even want to be chief now. It's like there's so many like things that go into like decision making, so many things to kind of balance, and it's like I awful job.
God bless Chief Batten. No way would I want his job.
Yeah, I wouldn't even want his job. It's like, oh,
no way. You just keep doing your thing. We'll
I know.
support
I
you.
just like reading my archival material and just writing my little articles.
There you
That's
go. And I'll
fun.
just keep interviewing you about the stuff you're doing, and we'll just do our thing. No, totally though. And we talked about the 5 tribes. So for those who are still trying to catch up on what all that means, that's the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek, now called Muskogee. And these tribes had really been busy during this time building these things, the tribal government, the school systems, and all that since they arrived. Um, and I remember reading in the articles about there was something about a change coming from Section 5 of the Five Tribes Act. If any of the 5 tribes chiefs refused or neglected to do his duty, he may be removed and the US president would fill the vacancy. And that aspect of legislation, which is something I didn't know before, that's still in effect today, right?
No, they I think they kind of repealed that particular section.
Okay.
Yeah, they definitely took that out once, once people learn kind of what was going on, and then, and you have the AIM movement, everyone gets really fired up. And so they definitely took
Okay.
that out.
Okay, that's good. That's good. We don't want that in there. Just take that out. And then March 4th, 1907 was also set as the closing date for the Dawes Rolls by the Five Tribes Act. And so as a reminder, the Dawes Rolls were the requirement for the 5 tribes to enroll in for multiple reasons. One of those reasons being so that they could receive their land allotments. So tell us more about the issues that arose with those land allotments.
Yeah, so going back to that Dawes Commission that I kind of mentioned earlier, their kind of job at first was to like convince all the 5 tribes that they should do allotment. And so eventually all of the tribes, including Choctaw Nation, they go like, okay, fine, like we'll do allotment. And so once that kind of gets passed through, the Dawes Commission, their job then becomes to do rolls of people. So
Okay.
they're like,
Yeah.
okay, we got to make a list of people. So who gets an allotment? Because the idea was every single person would get an allotment, and they would like be able to farm it and turn it into their home, kind of all of that. And so they, at first they were like, oh, we'll just like make a list of all the people and have them kind of do that. But it just became this logistical nightmare for them. They like had these wagons, and they had like a stenographer, and they had all these typists trying to help them like collect these rolls
Oh
of
my
like
gosh.
Choctaw people to make sure they had all of them. At first they were like, oh, the rolls that the Choctaws made throughout all this time, they're not good enough. But then once they kind of saw how difficult it really was to like have a roll of every single citizen, they're like, okay, well, we can use those lists and then do our own lists and kind of like verify if people are Choctaw. And so one of the things they would do is like they would have like kind of interviews where people would just they'd be like, okay, we're going to be in Atoka on this day, so everyone come. And so people would like come and camp out so they can kind of do their Dawes interview basically. And so they would like meet with the the committee, and they would like ask questions like, who is your mother, all this
Right.
kind of stuff. A lot of the stuff that you see on the Dawes rolls when you look for your ancestor, that information. And so some people like had other people kind of corroborate who they were, to be like, oh, they actually are Choctaw. They're not just like a random white person who walked off the street, which was
Which
actually
happened.
happened a lot. There were a lot of white people trying to get onto the Dawes rolls because they wanted a land allotments, because they just heard free land. And so they're like,
Sneaky
oh,
little
okay, we'll
boogers.
sign up. And so, you had people who would, like they'd be like, oh, I was married to my second husband was Choctaw, but then I've remarried and I married this white guy, and we have our 4 kids. And so we should all be put on the Choctaw rolls.
Oh
And
my
so
Lord.
this was something, Choctaw Nation had attorneys. And so like they were tribal attorneys basically. And so his job was like, no, according to our law, it's like if you remarry, you're no longer kind of considered a
Right.
citizen, right? Like you've left that because you no longer are a part of that. And so he would like have to take those people to court because, of course, those people, when they would get denied, they'd go to the US government being like, oh, they falsely denied my application. And so then he would have to be like, all right, this is what the law is. This is kind of what happens. And so, um,
I mean, that had to have been, as you mentioned, some chaos, but also just that cleaning things up constantly had to have been such a pain. I mean, we're talking about thousands of people.
yeah,
So,
so many.
yeah, very
Yeah.
interesting. And so sizes of the land allotments were determined by quality and value of land, correct?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are like they really stick to the number 320, and so 320, I guess, is like it's your land allotment is the average cost of that, like the like
Okay.
what the land is valued at. So like if you had a really rich piece of farmland, then like you're not going to get 320 acres of it because it costs like the value of it is way more than like something that's a bunch of rocks.
Yeah,
It's like
right.
maybe like 100 acres of rocky land
My
as
gosh.
opposed to like a much smaller size. And so they were really trying to kind of calculate kind of that. And so they had, geographers who had surveyed the land to figure out like what's valuable on it, what's not, and like kind of all of that. So like there is so much kind of at work with that. This Dawes Commission was like really hustling. And so, and it was doing it for 5 tribes, like they had a lot to kind of
Right.
um calculate. And then, of course, there was like the Choctaws who live in Mississippi. Like they had to, most people, the other five tribes, they didn't really leave people they didn't have the option to leave people behind as Choctaws did. And so the Mississippi Choctaws are kind of a very, kind of exceptional in that kind of way, like they had the opportunity to come over and get allotments and kind of prove that they're Choctaw. They also like sent people to Mississippi to do rolls of them. Um, so that added another layer of complication,
Good God.
the Dawes rolls. And so I think that's probably like why, if you're like, why does it say Mississippi Choctaw for my ancestors? That's kind of why. It's because it's related to that history of like your ancestors still were in Mississippi and they probably kind of came over later on and then they got enrolled that way. But they're very kind of really their own distinct group.
Yeah, and for folks that haven't learned a ton about this yet, over time you'll find that yes, there was a removal and there was the so-called Trail of Tears and all that, where a lot of people came from Mississippi, as did some of the other tribes as well, but we're just talking Choctaw right now. So they came over to Indian Territory, but at the same time, there were some that stayed behind. And so there were later removals as well. And so, yeah, that convoluted, it wasn't, nothing about this was cut and dry. I was reading in your article that parcels averaged, the average value, as you mentioned, was 320 acres. So after getting the value of all Choctaw Chickasaw lands and dividing it by the number of citizens, as you just said, this was the equal value of the land. And then some individuals would even get as many as 500 acres of rocky and unfarmable land, while another person might get only 80 acres, but it was really good farmland. And then you've got the poor people who are already living somewhere in Indian Territory, but their land allotments might be completely different from where they had been living. I'm just wondering, like, what did they do if they already had a farm and chickens and a house built? Did they just walk away from that and then go to their land allotments, or how did that work?
Yeah,
Like,
I think it really kind of depends on the person. You get, so the other part is like you got surplus and homestead
yeah, what
land.
does that mean? Explain that
Yeah,
to me.
so so the land is, they got it was like 160 acres of like or valuation of like what you're supposed to live on.
Okay.
Your family, this is where you're supposed to build a home and your farm and do all of the land improvements. And then you had a surplus that you could sell if you wanted, or you could lease it out, or you make it, I don't know, have another home there or something, right?
Right.
You were a little bit more free to kind of do with that. But I think a part of it was eventually later on, they were like, a homestead will not be taxed, whereas a surplus can be taxed. This
Of
becomes
course.
a big
Okay.
kind of player, much like later in the 1900s.
Wow.
That's kind of something that they settle on. But these categories are really kind of important for those kinds of taxation and distinctions of like that and of title. And so that's kind of that eventually later on plays out in a really big way.
So fun. It's like, okay, we're gonna rip your lands from you, give you new lands, and then we're gonna eventually tax you on the lands that really were supposed to be a gift to you. But okay. It really, when you were talking, it really made me understand why my family's land allotments were both in the Arbuckle Mountains, which is south, and then also further north in Wayne, Oklahoma. So it's like, what did they do? Did they just never go to the Arbuckle Mountains because it probably wasn't super farmable? But they definitely made, and to this day, our farmlands are still, and cattle ranch and stuff like that is still in Wayne, Oklahoma. They sold off the Arbuckle Mountains part probably in the 70s or 80s, 1980s. And so that makes so much more sense now. Hopefully that's a light bulb moment for other guests who are listening. Why were my family's land a lot? Maybe it was surplus and homestead, So land allotments were held in a restricted legal status. So just like American Indians had been treated as though they were ignorant in the past, this rang true here. So explain that restricted status for us.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are maybe a little more familiar with like trust land and non-trust land, and because that's how a lot of reservations are understood. But the five
Mhm.
tribes are really kind of different, right? Like they're not called reservations, and they're not quite treated in the same way as other reservations in the United States, right? And this goes
Mhm.
back to the fact that Choctaws owned the land; they held the title to their lands, whereas other reservations, they're not holding title. And so this is a really um, very important distinction. And so that's kind of like why it is a little bit more complicated in Indian Territory, and
Yeah.
why people like don't think it's not a reservation, or people won't call it a reservation. But it's just, this little subset that's a little bit more complicated to kind of figure out. And so the land restrictions basically kind of meant it kind of like is a trust. Um, so people couldn't kind of sell the land. They couldn't lease it without permission of like the BIA giving you kind of permission to do anything. Because right, so kind of the logic
Fantastic.
of this was that Native people, especially full bloods, they didn't know how to manage lands. They didn't know what to do. They don't know how to be property owners. And so, kind of when they were coming up um, with how to do the allotments and how to manage them, that was their kind of like logic is like, okay, so like these full bloods, they don't know how to manage land. So we're gonna put it under restrictions. So that means like if they want to do anything with it, um, you're going to have to ask the BIA. You have to get permission and all of that. And so this like
Unbelievable.
annoyed everyone a lot because
So annoying. So annoying.
people who might be like have be full blood but know how to like manage land, like our cattle ranchers, and are fully capable of managing their own enterprises and businesses, and had been doing it
For years. Yeah.
when it was still Indian territory. They had to like go to the BIA and be like ask for permission to do things that they already knew how to do. And so they were like, this is like getting in the way of my business. And so they wanted to get rid of the land restrictions. Um, but
I
then,
can see why.
people would also, you'd have people who would write letters being like, I don't know what's going on. So like, can you like not, can you keep the restrictions? Because like, I really don't want to pay taxes on this. And
Ah,
that was
interesting.
also like a big kind of thing. After statehood, um, the state of Oklahoma kind of realizes it doesn't really have any money, and it has no way to make money because half of the state belongs to a lot of Native people because they're allotments. And so they're all
Right?
held in restriction. And so that means they can't tax them. And so so I remember going through all these kind of congressional testimonies where they were just complaining and just talking about how all the native people were like using public schools and all the roads, and they shouldn't be allowed to because they weren't paying taxes. And so they like came up with this like crazy figure of like, oh, like the US government should pay us $10 million because all of these native people aren't paying taxes. And
Oh,
so
really?
yeah, yeah. And so that becomes actually like why you have the blood quantum requirement kind of be introduced to the land restrictions. And this kind of like, at first it's only supposed to be for 20 years, but then 20 years go by and people are like, no, we still want the land restrictions. And but then
Wow.
it's so kind of complicated. And so they're just really kind of trying to negotiate a way so that they get tax money on the land. That was always supposed to be Choctaw land. And so
Unbelievable.
that's kind of I hopefully helpful to understand about restriction.
Yeah, definitely. It's something I didn't even realize was a thing. Something that I do think a lot of folks would know is a thing is when it came to orphan children and then individuals with disabilities, they were a lot of times offered a guardian for their land or told they had to have a guardian for their land allotments. Um, so, I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but why don't you share a little bit about what would go on with that guardian scenario?
Yeah, so their guardians, you had to have a legal guardian to kind of manage your land and any kind of leases or anything like that. And so there were a lot of like white men who came around and like made careers off of managing the inheritances and land trusts of Native people. And so they would lease out the land and then get money from that. And so they would pocket the money for being like, oh, I managed your land for you. And so I get this kind of thing. And meanwhile, these like kids are living in poverty and like
Uh,
all these kinds of things. And so like that's something that happened to like families across Indian territory. Um, Angie Dubose really writes about this really well in her book, And the Rivers Still Run. And like she got in trouble because she was like exposing all of these like Oklahoma politicians and important businessmen being like, look, this is what you guys are doing with all these native people's lands. Like you're
right?
siphoning money off of them. And, like she almost couldn't publish her book
Go,
because of
Angie. Go,
it.
Angie.
And so like I
Wow.
think that book is really good. I'm not the biggest fan of her first one, which is about Choctaws, but I think the second one is
Okay.
really illuminating of like the kind of corruption that happened throughout this like 19 early 1900s period in which people were just like getting rich off stealing Indian land. So
Right. And it's the same thing that happened to my own family. My great grandmother, her half sister, and many of her aunts and uncles were turned over to a white guardian who had there's a proper way to say this, but basically he paid $3,000 to $5,000 for each one of them, and they were his servants. So and then he got to take advantage of their land allotments, and eventually they went to court and got a lot of that land back. So I'm just one of my family is just one of many, many others. I mean, we all know the stories of Killers of the Flower Moon these days. If you don't, go look it up. There's a book, and then there's a movie coming out, and that's it's a different scenario as far as it has to do with oil and gas, where with my family just had to do with the land and farming the land. But Oklahoma inevitably became a state on November 16th, 1907. The word Oklahoma comes from Choctaw words Okla and Huma, meaning red people. And so a lot happened for our people at that turn of the century. So let's talk about 1910 through 1920. Did things get any easier for our Choctaw people during this time?
if only that would be so nice
Oh,
for all of
bless
us.
their hearts. Oh,
I think this is a time period in which a lot of this is when Choctaw government is kind of um gets downsized a lot, right? They still have a lot of like offices, right? So one of the things with allotment, like the Choctaws were supposed to like settle their affairs, and then they would be kind of disestablished as a government.
yeah.
Uh, but that never actually really happens, and like it kind of like
Surprise.
gets a lot of trouble with winding up the affairs. And so what they were supposed to do is like sell off all of the land that didn't get allotted.
Mm,
So when they did allotment, they saved a lot of like the timberland, the coal land, um anything with like a lot of natural resources, because you couldn't just like give those to people, because then like knowing that there was stuff, because it's like
right.
know, you could do a lease and like you can make money off of that, and kind of, or you could sell it off at a much higher price. And so they kind
Sure.
of
Sure.
reserved all of those lands. And so one of the responsibilities of the chief and the attorneys that he was allowed to kind of keep on, was to sell all of these lands.
Mm,
And so that proves to be really, really difficult. As you remember, with a few, I think it's in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there's a lot about coal mining. Coal mining is such a big industry in
mm,
Choctaw Nation, and there's a lot of coal mines that,
right.
have to get sold. And so, um, one of the things is like you had to sell it at a certain kind of threshold, like it had to meet a minimum. Like you would have to kind of bid it out. So you were like, okay, we have this parcel for land. It's up for anyone to bid to purchase. And so they were closed bids. And so by the time they got it, they were never enough. They were
Mm,
not getting what the land was actually valued for. And when they were doing the surveys of the lands, they were like, these lands are worth a lot, but we can't price it that good because nobody will buy it. So they were
mm,
already underpriced once they put them out for bids, and those bids were never kind of high enough. And so that was really frustrating. And so they went through multiple rounds of that, of trying to figure out like to get all of this land sold. And then starting in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, you see a decline in the usage of coal.
hmm.
There, you have that energy transition where you move to oil. Oil becomes a much more important kind of commodity and a much more valuable one. And so, to like other people aren't as interested in getting into coal mining when, oil is much easier to kind
Right.
of an industry to kind of get into, because it's not as laborious to remove. And so that also contributes to like the devaluation of the coal lands and why they can't get enough money for it. So like there's all of these things going on in the
Oh
world
my
that is
gosh, right?
making it really hard for them to kind of sell the land. And
Well,
so yeah.
no, no, good. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just thinking about what a mess it had all become. I mean, they're trying to diminish the government, the Choctaw government. They've got it down at this point to chief, national attorney, mining trustee, and a council of Choctaw leaders. And then they've got all this stuff going on with the sale of the segregated coal lands. But that ties into the per capita payments too, right? Can you explain per capita to us?
Yeah, so I'm sure you hear about people with casino tribes, like they get their per cap checks and
Yep, they
everyone's
get the per
jealous
cap. Yep.
because we don't get them, because
We don't
our
get it, but we know
money.
what we have a lot of Comanche friends that do.
Yes, but you know what? There's a lot more Choctaws than there are of a lot of the per cap tribes.
That's true.
But so basically the per capita payments were like, payments left over from the US government. So like the US government was owed this much money. And so then that gets divided out among Choctaw people. Like they did that throughout the 1900s. Um,
Another thing I had no idea was part of our history. So
yeah. Oh,
thank you
well,
for
it's
bringing that to
actually
light.
in the 1800s. Yeah. So they would get those kinds of checks. And so like as they would started selling off parcels of land, it goes into the national coffers, and then it kind of goes out to everyone.
Wow.
But another problem is, because these processes are taking so long, people are dying, people are being born, you have new heirs. And so like all of the people who are supposed to get checks, some of them have passed away. And so they have like all these uncashed checks, and they're like,
Oh
oh, like,
man.
what do we do it? And then you have to figure out the
Yeah.
heirs. And so it also becomes very difficult for the BIA, because they're also supposed to be helping out with this. And so they're like, it costs more money to like do the admin for administering checks than it does to how much people get. He like people are getting
Oh,
$20 checks, but it costs us hundreds of dollars trying to track down all these people to make sure like that they're getting those payments that they're supposed to be having. And so like that adds to the kinds of chaos. Um, and then you eventually you have like the office gets like reorganized, and so then they have less people to do all of this kind of work, and like there's a lot of like administrative stuff in the BIA that they have their own kinds of dramas, and that but
right.
that affects what happens to Choctaws, because it's like it affects what they're able to kind of do, what's accomplishable and what's not. And so um that's kind of the complications with the per capita payments. So and they're supposed to
Interesting.
get like, these are like the last ones. Like there's no more money after the sale of these kinds of lands. Um
Ah,
so
well,
that's yeah.
well, and you mentioned that it was difficult to get those payments out to the Choctaws. So the Choctaws started becoming restless about it, right?
Oh yeah. They're like, where are my checks? They send all these
Right.
letters. They're very funny. They're like, where's my check? Like I know I'm owed this, and I
Understandably, right?
yeah. And
Yeah.
so I think I did a lot of archival research in the 20th century, and so just reading these letters that people would write to the BIA or like Congress or like the chief, they're just like angry.
Oh, really? Oh boy.
Yeah, they've got a lot of attitude. And so it's always like fun
Yeah.
to like, they get told off like rightfully, being like, we were promised all this stuff, and like, what's going on? Like, what are you doing over there? Just being yelled at. And I,
Oh,
I, I
yeah.
took a lot of joy out of reading those.
I bet that was really interesting because again, people are, trying to rely on this as part of their living. I mean, so to not get your per cap payment would just be a terrible thing for them. I mean, God, there's so much unrest, so much chaos, as you mentioned. I think that's a good word for it. And in fact, that restlessness eventually leads for them to start calling for the Choctaw government to be abolished, which is a scary thought too, on the other hand. So we'll talk about more about that later, but tell us about the role of chief at this time.
Yeah, so chief's job was basically to make sure that everything got sold. He kind of was like really overseeing whatever was going on. I think by this time it is, who is it? I'm trying to remember. It's not Green McCurran, but you have all
Um,
these chiefs who then they're kind of, it said that the chiefs would be appointed by the US government, and
right.
or by the president. But and I think a lot of people really pick this up, and they we didn't even get to appoint our chiefs. But when you actually look at the records of how things were done and managed, Choctaw people were deciding who the chief was going to be. Like the local BIA officer knew what was like going on. He's like, oh, these people feel a certain way about this person. Like they knew that they couldn't just pick anyone willy-nilly. Like they
Right.
really had to be
Right.
like attuned to like what was happening on the ground with community members and what their issues were and what they were concerned about. And so like they did hold their own kinds of like elections, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't think they're like the elections that we think of now, but they're like much more like grassroots and community oriented. But people are like gathering, being like, okay, we want this person to be chief. And so then they're like, okay, we picked this person. So you tell the Secretary of Interior, and the Secretary of Interior will kind of make them the chief. Because by then,
Ah,
the US president, he's like, I don't know what's going on, man. I appoint the Secretary of the Interior to like pick whoever. Because
right.
like he's like, I don't have like the time to learn about what Choctaw politics is on at that time. And
Right. Right.
um, like this is what it says on paper, but what actually happens is so different. And so I think that's also what I'm really trying to show. It's like what actually happened on the ground is very different than like these things that we read kind of just as like
Yeah. Right.
laws. And so it's like a lot of Choctaws had a lot of agency and were able to decide on their leaders. And sometimes they weren't happy with what their leaders did, but then they would like, pick someone else.
Right. Well, and I thought that was interesting too, because a lot of people thought that the president was appointing the chief, but like you said, he delegated that job to the Secretary of the Interior. But really, the Secretary of Interior was trusting that the Choctaw people would appoint whoever they wanted. And again, like you said, it probably was kind of like, we don't really have time to think about this, so pick whoever you want. But but it seems like that's significant though, because the Choctaw still had power and control over their affairs despite the interpretation of the law that stated the US president appointed the chief. So that's one small thing they did have some control over, which is kind of rare. So so we're moving forward now into the 1920s, and this decade came with some heavy duty land allotment issues. So let's dive in. After the end of World War I, Choctaws, like the rest of the country, were dealing with the effect on the economy, coupled with the results of federal budget cuts and their own governmental power reduction. So explain to us about the coal and asphalt lands, and they're still trying to get those per capita payments to Choctaws. What has now happened in this decade?
Yeah, so they're still trying to figure that out. They're still trying to sell all of those lands. I think it was about, I don't remember it. I think it's about 6 million acres, maybe. It was a lot.
Wow.
I don't know, but it was a lot,
Wow.
not that many. And it's a good chunk of land and it's worth a lot of money. And I think increasingly coal becomes like less viable. And so they were like, Choctaws were like, can the US government just buy this from us instead of like trying to sell it to a private person? Like it's so much hassle. And so, but for the US government to like buy this like giant parcel of land, it kind of has to go through Congress. Like they have to approve
Mm.
it and it has to go through all of the congressional avenues. And that is its own, Congress is its own kind of mess. There's lots of wheeling and dealing to
No
be
way.
and so then that becomes kind of the new kind of focus is like, are they like, okay, like if the US government buys it, like how are we going to make it happen? Like, where's the money going to come from? Kind
Right.
of all of that. And so that really has to get figured out in this time period. And so that's really what they're trying to do when they're valuing the land and kind of figuring out what to do with it. But and as we mentioned before, people were complaining, be like, where are these checks?
Where's the money? Show me
Checks.
the money. Yeah,
Because this is
totally.
the thing that they always are like holding over people's heads, being like, we just got to sell these coal lands and then you'll have your check and it'll be a big fat one because it's a lot of land.
Oh my
And
God.
so
Ugh.
people are just really antsy to get this particular check. And so, as you had mentioned earlier, this is like the people's growing frustration with this causes them to be like, you know what? Why do we even have a Choctaw government? We
Right.
should get rid of them because clearly they're not doing their jobs because they have not
Oh,
sold this land yet. And it has been 20, 30 years now. And like that they said they were going to do this thing,
damn.
haven't. And
Wow.
I feel like you really you when you go in the records and you read all of the kind of correspondence, you see the kind of like background drama that most people will never ever know about. Um,
Right. Right. Exactly.
and so like you can see like in the letters that Chief writes and the letters between like these BIA officials, like they're really trying their hardest to like get things done, but something falls through
Mm,
and just chaos in the office happens really. And so
right.
um but most people won't understand that and so they just kind of just assume no one's doing their job. But I think you really see in the correspondence that people are working really really hard to get things
Yes.
done, but it's not happening in as fast as people want.
And on top of that, they're native, so anything they want is going to even take longer because they're not top priority. Um, so that's crazy. Did they ever get their per cap payments?
So eventually, all the coal lands, it takes another, Carl Albert becomes a really important kind of player in this time period. This is starting to
Mm,
get into the 40s. Um, but he becomes a really powerful kind of advocate for Choctaws because, Carl Albert was the representative for District 3. And so back then, District 3, you could say is like the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. Like that was entirely kind of his congressional district. And so
okay.
he had like a very different relationship with Native people that I think is pretty rare because he really cared about Choctaws. He wanted to know what was going on. He wanted to know about, issues that they were having. And so he really listened to whatever they wanted and like really tried to be an advocate for them to get
Totally.
whatever they thought was really helpful. And so it's in 1949 that they finally kind of
Oh
passed
my gosh,
legislation
really?
to sell the coal lands. Yeah, yeah, and that's when
Oh,
they start. They're kind of able to get that check.
that's really sad because a lot of people by that point have passed on, and that's sad. But
Yeah,
and then on top of that, there were issues around the land allotments, which is baffling to me because the removal was in the early 1800s, and yet here we are in the 1920s and 30s, and there were still issues with the land allotments. Can you please help me understand this?
yeah. So the land allotments, because they were allotted out, they were no longer kind of the purview of tribal government. So the chief really had no power over like whatever happened to some individual Choctaws. Like, if like someone had stopped paying their lease and they're like, oh, we're taking over your land, and they tried to do something, they really couldn't do anything about
Right.
it. And so, like, the most kind of recourse that they would have is like writing a letter to Carl Albert or some other person in Congress, or writing a letter to the president being like, hey, I'm having this kind of issue. Um, the BIA has so many
Oh my God,
allotment
right?
issues to deal with. And um, in this time period, I think Oklahoma is like the most populous native population. And so everyone's still living here, living on allotments, having all these kinds of issues. And they're all going through the BIA, but they don't have enough people to like handle this because, um, they had a probate attorney who would like go to the different courts trying to help people out, being like, oh, okay, this is the problem. This is how you kind of fix it and all this stuff. There's just like
Yeah.
people, there's not enough resources to really kind of help people with their like land issues. And so
Mm.
that's kind of really the problem. And so, then you have state legislators who are like, hey, like, why is there all these kinds of problems? Hey, we need to tax more land. And so they're the ones
Right.
starting to fiddle more with like the land restrictions and introducing, like, as I'd mentioned before, the blood quantum kind of requirement, being like, okay, you can have it instead of for the next 10 years, 20 years, or like, cutting down the kind of timetables for that. Because
Yeah.
they still really wanted everyone to be off land restrictions. But then by this time, people were like, these land restrictions are helpful, right? Like, it's nice that we don't have to
Right.
pay tax on our land. Like, that's actually
Yes.
very useful for me as a person. And
Yes.
so then they start to kind of fight against it, right? I think the logic, from the present, you would think people would think blood quantum is a bad thing. You don't want to have that kind of thing. But back then, people were like, yep, this is helpful for me. So, like, we should keep it.
It
And
was
so,
saving them back then. I mean,
yeah,
considering the
yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah, so you you really have to kind of know everything that's going on to kind of understand people's logic in this time period. But
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's such a good point. We're on the native forums all the time. I'm sure both you and I, and you see a lot about being angry about the blood quantum. And I get it. Like there's two sides to that story that I completely understand. But again, understanding what's happening in history at this time and what's going on with the government, this was what they needed to be able to hang on to everything. So, and as you mentioned, Oklahoma politicians sought to have the restrictions removed so that they could tax the land and undermine the Choctaw land ownership. And so did the politicians succeed in lifting the land restrictions and starting to tax the Choctaw?
yes, so that was kind
Mm.
of the big things. It's like when they could implement that 50% blood quantum, they're like, that immediately like lifted up kind of a lot once they kind of get it passed. And so I think it's the 49 Stigler Act that is kind of what was in place for up until like 2019, 2018.
Hmm.
Um, where it had that kind of like quantum requirement, but that was kind of like the final form that it had. But it like went through 6 different kinds of iterations that we don't have to go into. I will do that in my
Oh, but
dissertation
it would
for
be
you
so
guys.
interesting though.
It's really boring. I was like, gosh, just look at this table. This is so boring. It's like so like this one little part of the law, and then this section is like,
Right.
but like
Kill
when
me
you're a
now.
historian, that's kind of what you do. But
As I
yeah.
mentioned, better you than me. You just bring us all the stuff that the layperson like myself would like to hear, and we'll be fine. No, thank you though for doing all this research. I know it's cost you hundreds and hundreds of hours. I mean, I hope our listeners understand that this is not stuff that you can just go out and easily find, that Megan has been digging and digging and finding all this stuff to bring to us and in the Biskinik so that we can all understand it better. I know that in 1926, you mentioned a report called The Problem of Indian Administration, later known as the Merriam Report, was commissioned by the Secretary of Interior, and it was on the conditions of Native Americans throughout the United States. So tell us about that report.
Yes. So that report was very much kind of trying to get a sense of like what's going on with Native people. And it was really finding the problem of allotment. They're like, oh, maybe this allotment thing was like maybe not as such a great idea to kind of implement widespread. It's like had a lot of these unintended consequences, but people could have told them that before, but they weren't obviously going to listen because they were so gung-ho about allotment. But I think it's like now people are thinking about welfare and being like, well, there's all these people who aren't working and they have all these different kinds of issues. And so why is it that Native people are like in these kind of poverty situations? And so so that report was kind of really trying to get at the root of the problem. And their answer was like, it's actually allotment, this thing. And so you also have a BIA administration that is, trying to be mindful of like, oh, how do we uplift these Native people and help them out? And so it's not
Yeah.
true allotment. And so that kind of gets them, changing how they're governing people. And so they're starting to think about, maybe like self-governance would be very helpful, because they're also, like administratively, it's a lot of work. And, this is
Yeah.
what I was saying about the allotments, right? Like they were sending lawyers to be in courtrooms every day of the week.
Wow.
In a different kind of community, just to like take care of the issues at hand. And so I think this is a time when they're really trying to like get rid of all of that work and be like, you know what, tribal governments can handle this issue, and then we don't have to kind of do it. And they called it, like empowerment.
I love that
Really
spin. It's empowerment.
passing off the problems they should have solved,
Right.
really. And so
What a mess.
yes, and so that's why you kind of have that Miriam report. And so this is kind of that you start to see that move into like the Indian Reorganization Act, and later the Oklahoma Welfare Act in the 1830s.
Or is it 18 or 1930s?
Oh, sorry, 1930s. Yeah.
That's okay. The only reason I wanted to clarify is because in my own brain, I know that I would probably confuse that and say it wrong to somebody else too. No, it's totally fine. So 1929 was the onset of the Depression. And as we head into this new decade of the 1930s, it was now President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, and he pushed for policies like the New Deal to stimulate the economy. And this included the Indian New Deal, another fact I know nothing about until now. So let's hear about that.
Yes. So the Indian New Deal was really trying to promote like Native self-governance, right? They saw the problems with poverty. And so, they're like, okay, no more allotment. We see from the Merriam report, it wasn't really that kind of great of idea. And so what they're thinking then is to kind of recreate those kinds of reservations. It's like, okay, you can have your lands back and you can be in charge of them, and you can kind of manage it and, deal with all the issues of day-to-day management, right? Because the BIA was not interested in kind of they didn't have the funds, the resources to kind of do all that stuff. And so they're like, okay, you guys can kind of
Right.
handle it. It'll be kind of your issue now. Because this is
Yeah.
how difficult it actually is. Because, you have to follow all these laws and respect people's rights. And,
You know. Yeah.
it's just, I think that they had to do. And so, when they did that report, a lot of those commissioners on the Miriam report, like they went to Native communities and they like did these listening sessions, being like, what are problems that you have? And so, um, Native people came out and they told them about it. And so, when they kind of heard about like Native people getting land having reservations and being in charge of their tribal lands again, they're like, this is literally the opposite of what you just wanted us to. Like, we're still trying to sell this land, right? This is still the 30s. We're still trying to sell these coal lands. Like, you can't be like, we're not doing this. And so
Right.
that actually leads Oklahoma, because it also had so many Native people, not just like Choctaws, but so many others. And so that was like terrifying to them. Like
Yeah,
the way that
totally.
Oklahomans were scared about McGirt when it came back, when it happened in like 2020, it kind of like happened then too, because they're like, oh my gosh, there's so many Native, like they can't take over. That's the whole
Right.
state, they're like, they're gonna take over the whole state.
Oh,
And so
no. Yeah.
they
Oh
yeah.
my
And so
God.
they opted out to like be a part of the Indian New Deal. And so it takes another couple of years. They kind of, because they're like, well, we still have these poverty problems and we still really want to solve them. And so that's how you kind of come up with the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, which is basically
Ah.
a different format, or like it's a bit of a remix that's kind of more palatable, of less like giving Native people more power. Um, and so you have that kind of, it's a little bit different, but like originally Oklahoma like didn't take part in some of the like most important parts of that Indian New Deal.
Wow. Interesting. So that makes so much sense why it ended up being Oklahoma had some variations versus some of the other um the what was the one that was called before that you said, the Indian Reorganization Act, sorry. So what were the benefits though of this Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act?
So a lot of the problems, the probates and restrictions, like that used to be handled in state courts, and
Okay.
that took up a lot of time
Oh, I
for
bet.
state prosecutors, right? And so they
Yeah.
decided to move that to a federal court, right? Like, so federal court, so that becomes kind of takes that off the plate of the state, right? Like that's a lot of stuff to kind of have to deal with. Um, they wanted to create like a fund for Native people to get loans. People
Hmm.
were just like, we need a loan, so I can just like
Yeah.
buy the stuff that I need. And so that kind of gives them a little bit more authority and autonomy, especially for individuals.
Okay. So there were some good things that came out of this, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was really helpful for people, especially, right? Like you're trying to get out of the depression, like you are just trying to make it day to day. And so this is really a time period where people are trying to, get back on their feet and not have such live in poverty.
Right. And, having more authority over their own affairs meant that the Choctaw Advisory Council was formed. And what were some of the results of that council?
Yeah, so Choctaw Nation, or, as we kind of talked about before, you didn't have the government anymore in a kind of official way, right? Like they had to get rid of their legislature, they had to
Right.
get rid of their judicial branch. And so Chief really thought it'd be helpful to have Choctaws from every single kind of community be able to advise the different kinds of laws and figure out what's going to go happen. Before, people were complaining about like Chief doesn't do anything, we should just get rid of him. I
Oh,
think this is
man.
kind of a way to bring people in, like have someone who could
Yes.
go back to talk to communities, being like, okay, like this is kind of the problem, and like this is what they're, trying to figure out, and have people know a little bit more, and so figure out what is the best recourse, like what do people want to kind of happen.
Absolutely.
And so they have this kind of Choctaw Advisory Council, which was made up of 11 Choctaw citizens from all of the different districts. And they also actually included like an at large. So this is like people who lived in Oklahoma City and who didn't live like in one of the counties in Choctaw Nation. And
Yes. Okay.
so they kind of selected their officers, and so they just like kind of planned what would be a good way to use Choctaw money, or like what are things that Choctaw needs. And so one of the things that they brought in was like a hospital in Talihina. um, and so they kind of like got things going for that, and then they were trying to figure out still how to sell those coal lands. And they
The damn coal lands.
I know that was like their biggest headache. They really truly like, oh my gosh, we
Oh,
have to keep dealing with this. And just things that supported Choctaw history and culture, so people would know about it.
yes. Good. So, I mean, that's good that that was established as well. Obviously, preservation and carrying on of our culture, super important. So, it sounds like the council was doing some good things. And then we're heading into the 1940s. So, you mentioned Choctaw William G. Stigler, who was elected to Congress in 1944. He was in District 2. He was a great advocate for the Native people's needs and created a set of useful regulations for the 5 tribes. And then U.S. Congressional Representative Carl Albert, as you also mentioned, was also an advocate for the Choctaw during this time. And the congressional representative was an intermediary between the BIA and the Choctaw Nation. And politicians especially targeted the southeast corner of Oklahoma in order to get those votes in Congressional District 3, where many Choctaws and Chickasaws lived. So during that time, the allotment restrictions, Congress passed an act in 1947 that removed those restrictions for the Choctaws, as you mentioned, also removed them for Chickasaws, Cherokees, Muskogee Creeks, and Seminoles, and for those who had less than 50% blood quantum. And in 2018, that act was amended to remove the blood quantum requirement. And then we just talked about the coal and asphalt lands. I'm just kind of recapping a little bit here. The Chickasaws and Choctaws owned 3,040 acres of asphalt lands in Pushmataha, Murray, and Carter counties, and 376,757 acres of coal deposits in now Atoka, Cole, Pittsburgh, Latimer, LaFleur, and Haskell counties. So that's a lot of land. You mentioned that the government would appraise those lands. What did they come up with?
So it's like 10 million, $41,030. Like that's
Okay. Wow, very
um,
specific. Yeah.
yes, luckily I have it here. Um, so that's kind of like the number that they're like, oh, this is kind of the value of the land. And so
Yeah.
that's what would have been sold off for the kind of per capita payments.
Okay. And of course this probably led to more frustrations for the Choctaws because that meant they couldn't recover the per capita payment from the sale of the lands. So what did they end up doing to solve for this, since they could only sell small portions?
They just went with it. Like, this is what you have, that's what you got to give out. And so, like
Okay.
essentially that kind of, or that, like they had they could only sell the little bit part. So they're like, we want the US government to just purchase it. And so,
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned that before, that it was like, okay, would you sell the land to the government? And they did. They bought it in like 1949, right?
yes, yeah, I know. I jumped ahead.
No, you're fine. I just wanted
Before.
to, yeah, I thought I'd recap that because I think it's just interesting that 1949, all those years that it just sat there, and the coal lands and the money that people were needing to live on, as we talked earlier. It's just, I don't know, it's baffling. But anyway, finally, so during the decade of the 1950s, a storm was a brewing. According to your article, many Choctaws were frustrated that it took those 43 years for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to sell the Choctaw Chickasaw coal and asphalt lands. And since Choctaws were supposed to receive per capita payments from the sale, the delay in the sale prevented many from receiving much needed money. Many who were unaware of the complicated nature of this process came to believe that Choctaw chiefs were not doing their job, even though they worked diligently with other Choctaw leaders, BIA officials, members of Congress, and local state leaders to move that process along. So really, we've kind of hinted at this throughout. Because of this unrest, what did some of the Choctaw community members do?
They were adamant that, they had to get rid of this Choctaw government, right? They didn't feel like they were doing enough. And so they would write letters to Carl Alberts and the president, and they would send it to the BIA being like, he's not doing anything, so we got to get rid of him. We don't need a government kind of
Oh
um
boy.
anymore. And so
I'm just trying to think of what it would have been like if they had succeeded in that. I understand their frustrations, but
yes,
wow, that could
yeah.
have
And
been
so they're really
detrimental.
frustrated. And so they take this up with people in Congress, and they start kind of like a movement being like, we need to like kind of terminate the Choctaw government. And so this is kind of something that the BIA then like picks up on, right? Because like now they're
Yeah,
starting
they're like,
like,
aha.
there's this termination thing going on in the air in other
Hmm.
tribes. And they're like, oh, so the Choctaws they don't want a government anymore. They want to be terminated. We can do that.
Oh God. Oh
We can
God.
get rid of your
Right.
government for you. And so,
Pounce on it.
yeah, I think it's like people get kind of funneled. They didn't realize what they were playing. They got, played into is like they
Yes.
use those kind of calls to be like, okay, then like, well, we can do a termination kind of government. And so we can terminate the Choctaw government. And so,
Wow.
and this is what people asked for, like that's kind of the thing, is like people asked for this. And so Carl Alberts, the different peoples in Congress, they're like, okay, if this is what you want, then
Okay.
we'll send it off to Congress as a
Oh
thing. The
man.
PIA has kind of looked at it, and so I think some people didn't quite get the full scope of what they were saying, or what termination actually means in its legal sense. And so
Right.
they pass a law, like being like, okay, so Choctaws want to be terminated, so they have to do XYZ, ABCD. Like there was a pretty long list of things that they
Really? Yeah. Oh man.
before they were kind of terminated. So, officially kind of. And it was like the only one of the five tribes to kind of go this kind of direction. None of them are like, yeah, let's get terminated.
I
But
know.
even but it's like very much like a circumstance of like, Choctaws happened to have coal, and then they had this huge kind of issue for years. And so like the particular circumstances of the land and like their kind of history of it, how they used to own land, like coal mines way back when, like that is what's like kind of bubbling up as an issue now. And so
Yeah, and I know that we kind of talk about it throughout, and I think it's important that we did because of that whole this was what was bubbling up. And I think it's a lesson for all of us to gather all our facts and data before we make decisions, especially one that could completely um destroy a sovereignty, you know. So, lesson learned.
yeah, so eventually they kind of pass legislation for like termination. And so they're like, this is kind of how things would happen. And so that kind of gets put on the table, and then that starts to be kind of something that the Choctaw government, along with like the BIA, is trying to work on, and like
Wow.
filling out all those criteria for termination.
I'm just curious how many of us Choctaws actually knew this was happening. And again, this is in the 1950s. The 1950s. This wasn't something that was going on in the 1800s. I mean, it started bubbling up, years ago in the 1900s, early 1900s, but my God. So part of this termination would be relocation, correct?
Yeah, and so it doesn't quite kind of, I think we have these like wider American Indian history. Like we hear about termination, relocation as this really kind of big program. And like there's definitely Choctaws who kind of participated in it, right? Like you had Choctaws going to Chicago, to California,
Yeah, right.
Dallas. but if you kind of like read, a lot of people stay where they are, they stay kind of in the area. And so um maybe it's because I was like reading stuff about people being in the same place, like I was reading congressional correspondence, so that's kind of skews the bias, I think, of what I was
Sure,
reading.
sure.
And so I wasn't reading like other people being relocated, but it didn't seem like as big of a phenomenon as like for other kinds of tribes. Or that was my kind of
Okay.
sense of it, just like from reading what was kind of there. But I'm sure there's like
Yeah.
a lot more out there that I'm missing that just wasn't in the kind of archival material. But a lot of people still kind of stayed, or they like had connections. Like there
Mhm.
was like letters from people from California being like, oh, like my family has this land. Like they still maintained a kind of connection to it. So I
Gotcha.
think in my like it always felt like people were still kind of connected to Oklahoma and to Choctaw territory in that kind of way. So you have all these people still like, trying to stay connected to
Yeah.
there.
Were the relocations, were they voluntary, or did they force them to go to these other states?
It kind of struck me as a little bit more voluntary. Like it's like,
Okay.
and it kind of seemed like, there's not enough opportunity in Oklahoma, right? Like it's very
Mm.
difficult to get a job. And if if you live here, you kind of know like there's not that much going on. Like there's a lot. You can work at the it was Dirk's back then.
Sonic's headquartered in Oklahoma. I would like to point this out. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so you have like Dirk's, which is now Weyerhaeuser, which eventually got bought out. And so like you could work at the chicken plant. Like there's not they're all low wage labor kinds
Yeah.
of jobs. They're not really anything that's gonna like lead to a lot more kind of advancement. And so I think it's more of a kind of social push, being like, there's not that many opportunities here, so you could go elsewhere.
Right. I remember believe it was Jake Tiger Seminole who was on was a guest on the show at one point, and he was saying, that his family had that opportunity. I can't remember if it was Michigan. I should probably go back and check my notes, but and that was the first time I'd heard about the relocation. And there's just parts of our history that it's not it's just kind of fallen by the wayside. We just don't talk about it very much because there's just so many other things to talk about. So pretty interesting. This is sometimes why we have groups of Choctaws living in other areas of the country. And then there was Chief Harry J.W. Belvin, bless his heart. Tell us what he tried to bring to the table.
Let's see. So Belvin, it's funny because Belvin was not like he was like an interesting character. Because you can kind of I read a lot of his correspondence, and he was a fiery dude. Like
Okay.
he had a temper, and
Oh.
if you made him angry, he would let you know.
Oh my goodness.
People would be
I
like,
mean, he does sound like an interesting character though.
was, and it's just like he would just like go off on people in these letters because they'd be like, "Oh, you're not doing enough for chief," and he's like, "What would you know? You don't know anything." And I'm just like, "Oh, this is aggressive." Like definitely kind of a character, but
That's so
so
funny.
yeah, and so I always loved reading his like hate mail because he responded with just as much vigor.
Oh my
um
God.
yeah, and so he really was like kind of an advocate for trying to you know get Choctaws like on the right foot. He wanted them to be kind of a little bit more assimilated to society, and like I think he was a little bit like less interested in but I have all these stories of people who like, he was their family member, and like he spoke Choctaw, and like they remember seeing him at church like when they were little kids and stuff like that. And so I don't know, he's such a kind of like interesting figure because he was like not he existed in a lot of people's lives that I know now. They're like,
Oh,
yeah,
really? Okay.
yeah. And so like, he's not just like this person who's not he's like disconnected because he definitely like had families,
Yeah.
related people in the office that I know, like
Oh,
is
wow.
a lot of people's like relative, but um, so it's now we're like at this kind of point where it's like, oh, I know people who knew him like when they
Right.
were younger,
We're
and
when
so
those decades where, yeah, there's
mhm,
people still living who knew.
um,
And
but
so go ahead.
yeah, so he was just definitely kind of really a character. And so but he still like fought for Choctaws. He's like, we should have all these different kinds of things. He went to court, took the US government to court for failing to fulfill their legal obligations to Choctaw Nation, and the court rejected it.
He
He
tried.
Yeah, I think he wanted to like scale up that advisory council into a kind of tribal council, but then that was kind of rejected. And he was really annoyed with how much the BIA was like interfering with people's daily lives, right? And so he's like, get them out. Like we don't, and that was part of the thing. It's like, it was also, you know, people complained that the chief wasn't doing as much work as he should have, but people were just also really tired of having to like go to the BIA to like, can I buy a fridge? I
Right,
need a
right,
fridge,
exactly.
can I buy one? And having to go through those kinds of loopholes. And so people were just like frustrated about that in their day-to-day lives. And so I think that's kind of a part of why he was like, well, maybe termination isn't such a bad thing to kind of happen.
Mm,
Yeah.
interesting. And it sounds like that he kind of did some things in the government that the Choctaw people may not have known about. Like in 1959, the US Congress passed an act called the Choctaw Termination to serve Choctaw's nation to nation relationship with the US government. Oh, sorry, to sever that relationship with the government. So, but did the Choctaw community members know that the Choctaw Termination Act had passed? I mean, knowing that also that Chief Belvin had kind of promoted it?
Yeah, and so I think this is kind of when people are starting and they kind of start to see like what's going on like in other native communities. This is kind of the early years of the Red Power movement, and so you have a lot, and it's also like after you have relocation, you have a lot of people meeting other native people, and they're like, hey, this is what's
Mm,
happening in my community, and then they learn about
wow.
like, oh, we have this kind of problem. And so you have this a lot more communication between Native people from different kinds of tribes with different sets of kinds of experiences. And so people are learning a lot kind of just from that. And so
Right.
then they're like, oh, okay. I'm sure a lot of them realized how different, Choctaw situation was than other tribes. And I think that gave a lot of people perspective that they might not have had before. That's kind of um, my guess, but people are getting a lot more involved. They're like, oh, maybe we should do more government stuff. Maybe we should be a little bit more involved.
Absolutely. It's exciting what's about to happen in that next decade. In congressional testimony years later, that's again, Chief Belvin, stated that the legislation that was read to and approved by Choctaw community members was different from the one passed into law by Congress. So I feel bad for Chief Belvin. I feel like he had a really good he really wanted to help, but it seems like there were some miscommunications going on there, and maybe things that the Choctaw people didn't know, which again leads us into the decade of the 1960s and 70s. Love that decade. It's kind of fun. And it was pivotal. It was pivotal in our Choctaw government's history. And it's exciting to me to hear what happened and how our people came together and realized the significance of our sovereignty. So tell us what was going on in the 1960s in Choctaw Nation.
Yeah. So now you have a lot, now you've had a few years in which people are kind of interacting, doing different kinds of stuff. And so they hear about the kind of this deadline for termination, which was like, oh, on this day, Choctaw's government to be kind of terminated. And I think you can start to, when you look at the archival stuff and the things that people would say, I don't think people have a full kind of understanding, right? Because there was a
Yeah.
lot of caveats, right? Like you'll be terminated if you do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, you have to find every single error who could have possibly like get land
Oh
or
my gosh.
and like that is like the BIA is like, there's no way we can do that. We cannot do that.
Right, right.
Like
No.
like it costs so much money trying to figure that out. Like people don't respond to letters, and so it's really kind of difficult. So legally they were never in any kind of actual real danger of termination, but
Right.
people, they were like fanning the fires. They're like, it's gonna happen next week, we gotta do something. And
That's
so
awesome.
and so like but maybe it's good that they thought it was that, because like it really got people moving. A lot of
Mhm.
Choctaws. So Valerie Lambert, she writes a lot about this. She's a Choctaw anthropologist,
Oh,
but
cool.
she writes about this movement in particular, about how there was a lot of youth in particularly Oklahoma City. They kind of heard what was going on with termination, and they're like, we got to stop this. And so they kind of like tapped into all the different, people live in Oklahoma City, but they still have family in Choctaw territory. So they would like go to the churches and they would pass out flyers. They started a mailing list being like, this is what's happening in Choctaw
Yes.
Nation. We have to like kind of fight it and go, um, um, tell everyone what's going on because we have to stop termination, right? And then people would go to churches and like give a speech being like, hey, this is what's going on, here, join our mailing list. And so that was their kind of like, it's a lot of grassroots organizing to kind of get people mobilized and fight against termination. And so once
Amazing.
they start doing that, people are starting getting rowdy. They're like, hey, we don't want this thing that was kind of happening, but like, don't forget a lot of people were asking for it, just like a few years before, but now
Right.
people have changed their tune, and it like, puts someone I think in a really awkward position, because like I think especially Carl Albert, he was like, I literally just did what you asked me to do, and now you're like all getting on in my case. And
Right.
so
Good point. I didn't even think about that. Poor Mr. Albert.
yeah, and so yeah, because I spent so much time reading how much Carl Albert really did for Choctaw people, and then all these people were like, "Oh, he's like the worst guy ever," and I was
Ah,
like, "You don't even know, like you don't even know what this man has done," and he's like Speaker of the House by now, so he's like third in line for president at this point, and like has a lot on his plate. Um,
wow. Damn.
um,
Damn.
maybe not by this point, but later, eventually, he does become Speaker of the House. But
Yeah.
he's very competent at his job, and it's also Oklahoma was used to be very. It was like only up into 2008, Oklahoma always consistently Democratic, and Carl Albert was like the best. He's the best politician of Oklahoma, I think, ever, and he's like the most famous Oklahoma politician. He's a Democrat, and he really
Yeah.
supported Choctaws, and he really tried to help them out. Um, but
Yeah. He did. He listened to what the people wanted, and then he just tried to go after that,
yes,
which is
yeah,
what our politicians are supposed to do, right? Listen to the people.
exactly. Yeah, I know. If there's a Carl Albert fan, it's me. I will always
Oh,
be
that's
a
cool.
Carl Albert fan, which is like kind of obscure.
That's
um,
you probably got like some bumper stickers and stuff,
I
right?
know
Like
it's an obscure fandom of mine. I was like, I'm a Carl Albert fan.
you're like, I'm the president and only member.
It kind of feels like that, even though like his name is everywhere.
No,
But
no, I'm sure there are others as well. I just love your nerdiness about it. That's so cute. It's probably like I think I see like something in your background that says Carl Albert on it. Just kidding.
oh, okay.
So again, in 1959, Congress passed that Choctaw Termination Act, but apparently the BIA hadn't completed all the requirements by 1962 because, Megan, as you mentioned, there were so many requirements. And so they didn't complete it all in order for the termination to be complete. So the deadline was extended 3 times. So the Choctaw helped to stop the termination from coming to fruition, right? It sounds like their grassroots efforts really did help.
Yeah, and so their organizing got them to kind of do a repeal of that termination legislation.
Awesome.
And so that definitely kind of helped, even though it wasn't going to happen. They still like got it repealed, which was really kind of important as well. And
Yeah.
so I think this, all of this kind of organizing really built up a kind of new political engagement that wasn't really kind of there in the same way before, right? Like people were
Yeah.
fired up. People wanted to be involved in Choctaw politics in a way that people hadn't been doing in the in the same kind of way. And it was a lot of young people. You talk, Charles Brown was a big kind of person in this movement. This is when David Gardner, who starts to kind of get his feet wet with this kind of situation. My uncle, Cullen Billy, he lived in Oklahoma City, and he was like a major kind of
Oh, cool.
person who put out, who helped with putting out newsletters. So this is like when they were talking about termination and kind of all that. They had these like little newsletters that they would pass around, but it would have things like ball games. Like this is when all the we're having all these different ball games, and so it very much
Right.
a community kind of thing. And so
I
they
love
were
that. I love your tie to that.
yeah, it's really nice. And so I didn't kind of realize it until I started like talking to my aunt. She's like, "Oh yeah, I remember how we used to go to like these singings, and we used to like prepare these newsletters." And then I would like pull out a newsletter and I'd be like, "Hey, this is Janice and Aunt Rose."
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so
I
I thought,
love that.
yeah,
Oh
it's
my
kind of funny,
gosh.
yeah.
Do they have any pictures from that time frame? It would be so cool to see some of their.
They definitely do. Well, actually, my aunt had house had a fire. So she like lost a
Oh,
lot of
the
her stuff.
fires, they kill
I
everything.
know,
We talked
they
about that
ruined
last time.
everything. But I, I always like have like pictures of the pictures of them. I'd be like, "Hey, look
Yeah.
what I found in the archive today. Look at little Janice, so cute." She's
Ah,
like,
that's
"Oh
so
my
cool.
gosh, no."
Uncle Billy, there you are.
Yes,
That's really
yeah,
neat though. How cool that you had those. I mean, those are people that helped save our sovereignty, you know? I hope I'm saying that correctly, the word sovereignty. But it's just it's a crazy thought that that was going on. I feel like we should have some kind of like celebration day every year, like, Choctaw beating the Termination Act.
that would be a nice one. That would be a good holiday.
Because
Yeah.
it is a big deal. It was a pivotal moment in our history. And even though if it probably wasn't going to happen because of all of those restrictions, still, even then, I mean, President Nixon signed the day before the termination was supposed to take effect. And as you mentioned, the Choctaws probably weren't in any actual danger of losing the government because of the criteria not being fulfilled and all that. But still, I mean, it's such an incredible story, and it was critical to our nationhood today. So, and your article points out that this was an important movement in our history because it taught our people that we have to remain vigilant and stay involved in tribal government. And so, as mentioned earlier, the laws made it seem that the US president selected the chief, right? Back when we were talking about that. But he would always delegate to the Secretary of the Interior, and Choctaws actually selected their chief. Now, federal policy in the 1970s and 80s, it would turn tribal nations towards self-determination. And in 1971, a law was passed that allowed the 5 tribes elections without oversight of the US president. Yay. So the first public election since statehood took place on July 30th, 1971. And old Chief Harry J.W. Belvin ran for chief and won, which surprises me, but it seemed he nearly caused big issues for the Choctaw with the termination situation. But it sounds like he did have a heart for the Choctaw people. And so, yeah, so they elected him. And something that was born out of the anti-termination movement was a newsletter called Hello Choctaw. Tell us about that.
Yes. So this is that kind of little newsletter that I had mentioned earlier. So Hello Choctaw was very much something that pushed people to learn about issues, to know what kind of was going on in the community. When there was a singing, you knew where it was, and kind of just had a calendar of stuff. And you're like, oh, we're having this kind of this sale or whatnot. And so it was really something that connected people.
I
And
love that.
um it's it's very scholarly kind of thing, but people always talk about newspapers are like this big force of nationalism because everyone's reading the same thing. And
Hmm.
so people really kind of build a community and like are can like imagine each other as being in community with other people. And so it's a
Yes.
really important part of nation building. And so Hello Choctaw, I feel like really proves that because it wasn't there kind of before. And like it communicated every like the anti-termination movement, and then it became kind of a thing where it's like, oh, what are the things going on in Choctaw Nation? Oh, we're having an election. And then people
Mhm.
were talking about all of that kind of stuff, and it's like, oh, we're gonna have like a debate where people are gonna like talk about these kinds of issues and stuff. And so Hello
Yeah.
Choctaw, eventually becomes is like basically what becomes the Biskinik, right? It kind of gets transformed and it gets a new kind of name, but it, serves that same kind of function.
Oh, totally. And I think we take for granted that news is so readily available, both throughout the US for general news, and then also, of course, with our Biskinik, as you mentioned, the Choctaw paper that we all know and love. But knowledge is power, and the Choctaw Nation could have significantly changed with the termination policy due to not having that communication to let Choctaws know what was going on. It was a great lesson that the news is crucial to maintaining that tribal government and just being in the know in general about our goings on. So I love that. Hello Choctaw. Thank you to all those people who did all that guerrilla warfare to get that going and to make sure that termination policy did not go through. So then in 1975, another election meant a man named David Gardner defeated Jimmy Belvin. What were some of the things that Chief Gardner brought to our Choctaw people?
Oh, so this was something I should have edited, but Jimmy Belvin didn't actually run in that kind of year, but David
Oh,
Gardner
okay.
was the one who won that election.
Okay. So basically in 1975, Gardner became chief.
Yes. So he's elected kind of chief. And so he's really young when he gets kind of elected. In the years kind of before, he like had filed a lawsuit because he like ran when he was 30, and they're like, "Oh, you can't run for chief because you're too young. Like you're not at the appropriate age." And so like Belvin,
Oh,
I mean not Belvin, Gardner took them to court, and so but they kind of like it doesn't pan out for him, and so they just wait till he's after 35 to like run for chief and kind of go through all that. And so eventually he wins. Um,
okay, that makes sense.
yes. And so um Gardner really has a vision for Choctaw Nation, right? He really wants he wants people to invest in culture. He wants everyone to be like kind of connected again. And so he really wanted to like bring Choctaw people in together. And he pushed for a new constitution. He was really trying to get employment opportunities for people. He was responsible for kind of getting the Presbyterian College here in Durant to become the Choctaw Nation headquarters. He's like did a lease from them. And so for many, many years, that haunted school became the headquarters for Choctaw Nation. And he did things like kind of go for a dictionary, like we should have a Choctaw dictionary, because that was in those newsletters they would like have like lists of Choctaw words, and like just teaching people
Right.
things kind of like that. And so that was always important to him, and so he kind of continued that when he was chief.
That's awesome. He did a lot of good stuff. Thank you, Chief Gardner. And unfortunately, though, he didn't complete his 4-year term. He passed away at just 38 years old in January 13th, 1978 from cancer. Very sad. So now we're coming up on the 1980s, and next up, Chief Hollis Roberts, who had experience in the House of Representatives and Tribal Affairs, was tasked with the creation of a new constitution. So, what's the story with this new constitution?
So, they're like, we have a government, we need a new constitution, right? Apparently, like the last time they had one was like back in, what was it, 1890? Like
Okay.
it
Yeah.
was a really old one. And so uh technically, and so they had passed one in 1979. And so some people were not very happy with it. They're like, this isn't constitutional. Actually, like you didn't go by the old constitution's like procedures for starting a new
Ah,
constitution, right?
okay.
People weren't kind of happy with it, so they took it to kind of court essentially. And so Creek Nation nearby also had a similar, like they were going through something very similar. And so um they had taken that to the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court kind of ruled, was like, well, technically, this pre-statehood constitution, like it never got rid of. So that's the legal one. So if you want a new constitution, you have to go by the older one. And so
Oh,
that's what
okay.
Choctaws kind of realized that they have to do as well. So that 1979 constitution is not technically legal because they have to go by the procedures of the 1890 constitution.
Oh,
But it's
wow.
like,
Okay.
well, like you can't
Whew.
just copy that. Oh, it says 1860. Yes. So 1860 Constitution. So
Okay.
that was still in effect. Like that was a totally different kind of time period, right? Like Choctaw Nation was totally different. It had a court system, it had all these kinds of things that Choctaw Nation like kind of now didn't really have, but they were wanted to kind of bring back. Um,
Wow.
and so they had to like hammer out a completely new constitution which had some new stuff in it. So they introduced the position of assistant chief, and
Okay.
that's an appointed position. They created criteria for tribal citizenship that was based on lineal descent. So if you had someone on the Dawes rolls and you were a lineal descendant of them, you can be considered a Choctaw citizen. It established the 12 council members, and then it just set up a timetable for when everyone gets elected because they didn't want everyone being up for election every year. So it kind of toggled them back and forth.
Gotcha. And it's kind of interesting when folks are trying to apply to become a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, this is the basis for why they have to actually find the lineal descent from blood Choctaws listed on the final Dawes rolls. And so it is heartbreaking for some people who are like, I'm clearly Choctaw. I descend from all these people. I know their names, I know their histories, and yet they can't actually become Choctaw members because their ancestors did not get on the Dawes rolls. And so, but that doesn't mean they're any less Choctaw. We're all one big family no matter what, right? Even if some Choctaws cannot technically have their CDIB card, their certificate degree of Indian blood card. I always want to give a shout out to all Choctaws, regardless of if they have their CDIBs or not, because we are all family. So in 1983, the Choctaw voters approved the new constitution. And then what happened next?
So, once you have a constitution, like you're really kind of in business and you can kind of do whatever you want. And so one of the big things is like, your government, you need money to operate. And
Right.
so I think the chief at the time was really kind of thinking of ways to come up with revenue for a tribe, right? Because state governments, as we kind of talked about before, they get their revenue through taxes, but
Uh-huh.
tribes can't tax people. There's no income tax, there's no land tax, they don't have any of those kinds of things. And so that's actually one of the big challenges. And this is why everyone always talks about economic development and finding, and this
Right.
is kind of how gaming becomes so powerful, right? Because they need money and they need a way to kind of do that. But before kind of that happens, Choctaw Nation takes over like Indian Health Services. So basically, IHS used to run that hospital in Talahina. And so now they're kind of managing their own hospital kind of services. And
Awesome.
so that becomes a way for them to figure out how to, take care of tribal members, but also, do things on their own. And so they were, trying to fulfill the needs of Choctaw people. So that people need houses. So they're like, okay, housing authority, we're going to be in charge of building houses on the reservation. And so we need, we had all of these rights. And for a lot of time, other people got away with stealing land. So we're going to take all these people to court and we're going to get
Really?
money kind of like in
Yeah.
that way. And so, you have like that Arkansas riverbed. Um, um, that gets settled in 2002, and that leads to like $40 million settlement that gets kind of divided between the Choctaws, Cherokees, and Chickasaws. So
Wow.
that's money that they can use for like whatever kinds of projects. And like, they're really trying to show like we have sovereignty, this is our land. Like,
Right.
I'm not gonna let you guys like mess with it. There was also like the mishandling of those timberlands, because you remember they had been kept out of allotment. Uh,
Right.
they then were like, those lands, they got sold off when they shouldn't have, or like we didn't get paid when we should have. And so they had that kind of documented. And
Ah,
they took that to court. And so that doesn't get resolved until like 2015. So jumping a little bit ahead, but it also becomes, I think, one of the largest settlements that the US government does to a native tribe, because it's like, you
damn.
mismanage funds, you're going to kind of pay for it. And, those are
Finally some restitution, right? Doesn't it feel like, okay, things are getting better?
a little bit, but like they were fighting in court for so long
Mm,
that it's just a little frustrating that you have to spend 20 years in court to get something, the money for that. And then so, but
right,
like
right.
it was really trying to assert like that sovereignty, like being in court and like fighting for those rights. You also have like the water settlement, which happens also later on. But those are, these are our lands. We want to take care of it. And so that you
Right.
have kind of the beginnings of that in the those 80s and early 90s.
Wow.
And then of course, lastly, you have the opening of the Bingo Palace
The
in
bingo palace.
yes, yeah.
It sounds like there's some fun stories from that time in the bingo palace. What do you have? Do you have any
There's
scoop
so
for
many
us?
great stories, right? A lot of the people who work for Choctaw Nation got their start in the casino.
Oh,
So I
wow.
had this great opportunity to kind of interview people who were like worked at the casino at a,
Love
and
it.
they talked about how fun it was. They had like a money machine where they would like have the cash go on all around you and you're supposed to catch it. And so everyone like James Dry talks about, he's the council member for District 9, and he talks about how he got his start flipping burgers at the Bingo Palace. Like that was his
Nice.
first job.
That's so cool. I love that.
And so like he just kind of made his way through, like once it became a casino, like moved up, and like a lot of the people who were like running those places back then are like the people running the casino now. And so
Wow, that's amazing. Like ground floor stuff.
yeah, yeah.
That's so fun. I love that. And the fact that so many people are still working for Choctaw Nation that were bingo employees, that just shows that it really is a big family. No corporation and no organization is perfect, but I have to admit I'm very biased about our Choctaw Nation and the employment that goes on, and legacy folks that have been here even since the Bingo Palace. So cool.
Yeah, it's always nice to like kind of hear people who've like worked for the tribe for like 20 years. They'll be like, "Oh, I started at bingo, then I did this." And like they like you can probably bounce around the most random different departments. And like um
Right.
uh at the cultural center we have people who are like, "Oh yeah, I grew up like I worked at the Bingo Palace, and then I had my kid, and then I went back, and now I work for cultural services and doing all this kind of
Amazing.
stuff." Like one of the maintenance guys was like, "Oh yeah, I used to work there." And like we all used to be a crew. Joe in our
Aw,
office said he used to do security at the
no
casino.
way.
Like, yeah, those were some days. Like, it's
Oh, I bet.
yeah, it's really funny, and it's people are they look back on it very fondly.
I love that.
They like talk about how they made connections with the like patrons, being like, oh, they would
Yeah.
always like, I think James Dry had mentioned that he was like the pallbearer for like people who used to come to the Bingo Palace,
Oh,
because like
wow.
they had built such close kinds of relationships.
Right. And not to mention bingo's fun. Like I
Yes,
I have
yeah,
one of those things with the balls in it at my house. Like I'm always looking for somebody to play with me, but I can't ever find somebody to play. But it's so much fun. Give us some bingo. That's
yeah.
good, clean fun right there.
Yeah, yeah. And so bingo is really kind of beloved, but I guess like it's not the moneymaker that a casino is. Apparently,
Surprisingly, y'all.
yeah. Someone had mentioned, I think that the casinos can in one night make what the bingo palace made in a weekend or like a week.
Oh my gosh, really?
So like it was no contest, even though like they made
Right.
money from bingo, like casino gaming is like a much, much more lucrative endeavor.
Kind of a bigger deal,
Yeah.
right? And it really
So
was like, go ahead.
oh yeah, and so that's eventually kind of how it gets phased out, but like you people loved bingo.
That's so fun. Maybe when we retire someday, we can just like have our own bingo palace. We can just play bingo all day. We'll
I
get all the
yeah,
older folks with us and yeah.
yeah.
Actually, I could do it now. I'm probably of the age now where I could just sit and play
Yeah,
bingo
I
all
was like,
day.
I would spend a weekend playing bingo and not doing anything else.
Yes, right?
Yeah,
Especially if you can be in that money thing where the money's flowing around.
yeah, that sounds great.
I want some of that. I want somebody else to have the money floating around where I can watch it. But well, the 1990s decade, it saw such success with that bingo palace, as you mentioned. And it was really kind of a jumpstart to some of the other business ventures that Choctaw Nation operated, like the Choctaw Inn and Three Arrows Restaurant and travel plazas. And then in 1999, its own construction company to build these businesses. That's crazy. And then what was the next venture after that?
Yeah, so that
Ta-da.
was the casino. I'm always like jumping ahead of myself,
Oh no, you're fine.
but yeah, so once you have gaming is taking off also like in other parts of native of Indian country, and so it's becoming increasingly popular. And then once you have that 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act,
Yeah.
um, which kind of dictates, you have to do a state compact obviously to be like what types of machines, like the different kinds of levels of gaming. So like blackjack is one class, and then a slot machine is different, and they're like,
Oh, okay.
so there's different, those are like important distinctions, and so that's why some places have it and some places don't, like if you go to different kinds of states, because it's kind of based on that kind of stuff.
Okay. Well, and what I absolutely love is that you talk about how Choctaw Nation in 2004 worked on state legislation that would help Oklahoma tribal nations upgrade their gaming machines to the Vegas style slot machine and other class 3 games. So this led then the Choctaw Nation to enter the gaming compacts that shared some of the earnings with the state of Oklahoma. So that kind of hand in hand thing at the time anyway. And so over the next year, Choctaw Nation massively expanded its gaming operations and quickly became its most lucrative business. Woo! That's exciting. And then they opened their first casino in 2006 in Durant, Oklahoma. It was so successful that plans for expansion came not long after the opening. That's crazy. And then the Grand Tower in 2010 and then the 2016 was a spa tower. And then in 2022, this year, the Sky Tower was added. Is that complete now?
Oh yeah, it's done.
Okay. Okay. Well, and I was so bummed because my sister and I stayed at, I believe it was the Grand Tower together, and we were looking at the construction going on at the Sky Tower at the time and going, oh, I really want to stay in the new one too. So really cool and fun experience to go to the casinos, the Choctaw casinos. Um, I highly recommend it. So everybody, take into consideration too that you're not just out there having fun, although it is so much fun. You're also supporting the tribe, which means that you're supporting our healthcare, our elders, our housing, all of those things. It's super beneficial to the tribe. And all of this expansion really provided more jobs and opportunities for tribal members too, right?
Yeah, so it's so interesting to have like kind of done the whole history of this, of this kind of era of Choctaw Nation, right? Because
Right.
what people learned in bingo, then they then kind of applied to the casinos, right? A
Hmm.
lot of people got their kind of start there and then are able to kind of grow as Choctaw Nation grows. Like they learned the skills kind of along the way. And so
Mhm.
it was really nice, like meet all the people who like are in these like tiny little pockets all over Choctaw Nation who were a part of this kind of journey. And so it's
I
really
love that. I love it so
amazing to
much.
have gotten to meet with people and visit. And yeah, I loved that kind of part of the
Oh,
this
yeah.
project.
Oh, for sure. I bet that was a lot of fun. And, those are things you won't find in the history books, really. I mean, not all those fun human details, but
Yeah, it's very like, people just like they're very fond memories for people. And so
right.
that's, I guess, whenever they see old pictures of this, they can be like, wow, we really kind of grew with the nation. And it's really crazy to see where Choctaw Nation is today and like what it kind of does. Um, I had to get directions from Dallas this morning, and then I typed in Choctaw, and then it was like Choctaw Amphitheater, and then like 'cause
Wow.
I think that for the baseball, I assume, or something like they're able to
Oh,
buy something down there, and down in Dallas or that Dallas area, and I was like, oh,
right.
that's crazy.
That's so cool. Everywhere. We're everywhere.
Yeah,
So
I was
cool.
in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, and I think we were watching the Dallas Mavericks game, and then there was, like, this little Choctaw ad, and I was like, "Wow, look at little Choctaw casino, I can see about it in Seattle."
That's so cool. Well, and I call on a lot of clients for my day job that come up from Dallas and Fort Worth area to go to the casino, and they absolutely love it. So it's nice that Oklahoma and Texas can have that kind of relationship going.
Yeah.
But well, I mean, now that we've talked about something fun, I thought we'd talk about something not fun, taxation.
Back to
So
taxation.
we just must know about this taxation thing. So
Yeah, yeah.
where are we on that topic at this point in this decade?
So now, of course, you had taxation as a kind of problem about land in particular, throughout the 1900s, and then it kind of gets kind of resolved with the land restrictions, and they kind of like, okay, they're like, there's a lot less people with restricted land. Of course, they would prefer there be no one with restricted land because it's more
Right.
land for them to kind of tax. But then, states also tax different kinds of things. And
Mhm.
so one of those became motor fuels and tobacco. And so that also became something that the tribe, once it kind of after they got kind of started, and um, Chief Roberts was able to kind of negotiate kind of compacts, being like, okay,
Mhm.
like because we sell tobacco products that don't get taxed, we'll give you some of the kind of money for that. So you like, have that kind of compact again, just very
Right.
similar to the gaming compact. And so they did that for motor fuels. And so that kind of has to get negotiated also in the 90s and early 2000s.
Ah, so much fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, once Choctaw Nation is starting to like get back on its feet and like just like it kind of was before, it's really
Mhm.
able to kind of challenge what the state kind of took advantage of for a
Right.
really long time. And so,
Oh,
and of
yeah.
course, like we see that a lot with McGirt now, right? Like having that kind of
Yes.
um that in our kind of like back pocket, it's empowered us to do a lot more and to take over, to do a lot more.
Mhm. And yet it's being challenged and so I mean for our listeners, go Google McGirt versus Oklahoma. That's MCGIRT versus Oklahoma to learn more about what's going on with that. It's interesting. You can find something new every couple of months about what's going on with that. But it is an exciting time for our tribe all at the same time because it means more about our sovereignty and about our lands becoming reservation lands versus just trust lands. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly, but definitely go check it out. So in June of 1997, Assistant Chief Gregory Pyle was sworn in as chief. And in 2007, Chief Pyle appointed Gary Batten as assistant chief. And after serving as chief for 17 years, Pyle retired at the age of 65, leaving Assistant Chief Gary Batten to finish out his term. Gary Batten was then elected as chief in 2015, and he was reelected in 2019. And under Chief Batten, we've seen a resolution of lawsuits Choctaw Nation had filed protecting Choctaw sovereignty. Tell us more about that.
One of those lawsuits I had kind of touched about a little bit before was about those timberlands. And so
Mm-hmm.
um, you went, as I had mentioned earlier, allotment kept a lot of those timberlands out. but someone was looking at the old records, and then it was revealed that like 1.3 million acres were sold to local timber companies without compensating Choctaw Nation for it. And then those records were kind of kept, and so they had it. And so Choctaw Nation was able to kind of take those records and be like, hey, you owe us all of this money for selling all these lands without compensating us. And
Right.
so there was a lot of kind of litigation for like 9 to 10 years between the Chickasaws and the US government to get a
Wow.
settlement of $181 million. And so that happened in 2015.
Oh, so that's the big one you were talking about.
Yeah, and so that's one of the largest settlements that the US government has had to kind of give to a tribe or to tribes.
Wow. That's really exciting about that settlement. And it just shows some of the shadiness that had continued decade after decade, honestly. But so I'm kind of sad that this is the last of your series through the decades of our Choctaw history. And I'm going to say a quick quote from the article. Since arriving in our new homelands in the 1830s on the Trail of Tears, Choctaw people maintained resiliency and learned much from the past to bring us to where we are today. Learning from centuries and decades of interaction with European and American traders and settlers, our ancestors learned and developed what they thought were the best strategies for counteracting their infringement on Choctaw lands. They secured powerful treaties that still protect many of our rights and lands, even if those treaties were not perfect and were also undermined by the US government. When faced with major challenges like the outbreak of the US Civil War and debates regarding allotment, Choctaw leaders chose what they thought gave the nation the most autonomy at the time. And while those decisions might not have played out as the Choctaw leaders had hoped, they have had a lasting impact. Despite the great difficulties that Choctaw people faced, we have preserved through it all and remain today. Well said, Megan. Wow. Thank you for sharing your work with us, a culmination of hundreds of hours of your research.
Thank you. It was an honor to get to write so many articles and to have this research out to Choctaw people. I could write a book, but I know that I will not have as much readership as the Biskinik, getting their copies every month. And I think that that's a real gift. And I'm really honored to have Choctaws read my writing. And I hope it's helpful for you and that you can learn something from it. So I'm really honored to have been able to do it.
Whether you're Choctaw or not, or Native or not, our Biskinik paper is a wonderful source of information. So listeners, you're invited to follow along with our news online. You can Google Biskinik, Biskinik, or check out my Native Choctaw Facebook page where I'll share the link. So Yakoki, y'all. Thank you again, Megan.
Yakoki.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Simply search for Native Chalk Talk. That's Native, CHOCTALK. And check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.